Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Our guest today is Richard S. Reddy, an esteemed historian, author, and researcher whose work has significantly shaped our understanding of the Church's role in both the perpetuation and abolition of slavery. So let's have a listen with your host, Wendy Aris, of the Dis Affamie History podcast.
Thank you so much, Richard, for coming on to the podcast and to speak about the Church's involvement in perpetuating the abolition of slavery. And before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, so my name is Richard Reddy. I'm currently the Director of Justice and Inclusion for an ecumenical organisation in Britain called Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. I'm the Director for Justice and Inclusion. I'm also a writer, broadcaster, do quite a bit of public speaking on a range of religious, cultural and political issues.
No, thank you so much for that. So we'll start. And, my first question is, what inspired you to write the article, the Church's involvement in perpetuating the abolition of slavery?
I suppose it's something that I've always been very interested in. Back in between 2005 and 2008, I worked for an organization called Churches Together in England, not to be confused with my current organization, Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. And I was the project director for an initiative called Set All Free. And this initiative sought to mark the bicentenary of Britain's ending of the transatlantic slave trade in 2007. So it was my job to talk about the work that the churches did in ending the transatlantic slave trade. So you're talking about people like William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, the Clapham sect. But what I found in directing this particular project was that many people felt more comfortable talking about abolition, talking about the good things that the church did in seeking to end the enslavement of Africans, or the trafficking of Africans from their continent to the Americas. Many people felt more comfortable talking about that than talking about the first half of the story, which involved the collusion of the churches. The churches providing spiritual, financial, and even emotional succor and support to this particular trade. For me, if we were going to be holistic in the way we actually marked this specific important anniversary, then we needed to tell the whole story. So we needed to talk about what the churches were doing before they found their conscience, before they found their moral compass, and said, well, this forced trafficking of individuals is wrong. So, to me, it was about, telling the whole story. So that's where my interest came from. And out of that work, I wrote a book called Abolition, that specifically looked at the church's role in both enslavement and freedom, not just specifically stopping at the slave trade, but looking at what the churches did from the 15th century right through to the 19th century, a warts and all exploration of what someone called the good, the bad, and the downright wicked. So yeah, that's where my interest came from. But also, my parents are from the Caribbean. My parents are from Jamaica. And given that particular history, of that island,
Yeah.
it's hard to really sort of look at the history of Jamaica and not, see or discuss something about African enslavement. So it's something that has been of interest, of personal interest, I would say, for most of my life. But
Hmm.
what main catalyst really was directing that particular project that sought to mark that significant anniversary.
No, thank you for that, because I mean, I always just ask just to see what, people's motivation are for
Mhm.
writing and delving into certain topics, because as I said before, this is not a topic that is very talked about, so to speak, when it comes to this time frame period. And would you be able to provide, I guess, some historical context on the role of the church played during this time frame of slavery?
Well, I mean, so for instance, when we say the church, I use the big C for the church. So it's really all the churches. So you've got, in the 15th century, uh, popes who were connected to the Catholic Church, justified the Portuguese exploration of West Africa, both in terms of slave raids and slave trading. Decreeing this to be licit or legitimate. So you've got Prince Henry, who was
Hmm.
someone recorded as the first known individual to actually trade in enslaved Africans in the 1440s. You also had in the 1490s the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Spanish-born Pope divided what was then the known world in two and gave one half to Portugal and one half to Spain, and he basically gave Portugal the sole rights to trade in goods coming from Africa, and those goods, for want of a better word, included human beings.
Hmm.
Uh, that sort of gave license to what we now know as African chattel enslavement. So that was the church then, and you think of someone like Christopher Columbus, a so-called great explorer, and how on his second journey, he took a number of enslaved Africans with him, but also a number of priests. So a lot of the spiritual justification was there from the outset. It was there, the idea was to create great wealth for European nations, share the gospel with so-called pagans or heathen individuals, but also to make money. And it became part of what was known as the Three Cs, you know, uh, civilization, commerce, and Christianity. They all went hand in hand with a colonial enterprise. And a lot of that colonial enterprise was based around, particularly when it came to Black people, African enslavement. But you have situations, particularly in terms of my country, Britain, where the established church, but also non-conformist denominations, uh, 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 sent missionaries to parts of Africa, but particularly to parts of the Caribbean, where they sort of preached the gospel that, from in many respects, was a little short of brainwashing. Encouraging them, enslaved Africans, with this sense that um, either they didn't have souls, or that the Bible justified enslavement, or this case of don't worry about life on this in this world. What you need to be focused on is the by and by. How things will get a lot better for you when you get to heaven. So there was definitely among some missionaries, among some clergy folk, this sense that Africans were spiritually, um, uh, well, they lacked something spiritually. Either they couldn't become Christians because they didn't have souls, or they were lesser human beings. And certain scriptures were twisted, certain scriptures were distorted to justify um, what can only be described as a racist ideology. And that, some would argue that that's still with us today, and it's played out in many different ways. So it's a legacy really of some of the ideas and some of the behaviors and some of the practices that came into being during that particular era. So the church themselves, or the churches themselves, had a key role to play in a lot of this. And some of the conversations that are taking place today, around the issue of reparations and contested histories, are connected to what took place then.
Yeah. Oh, definitely, absolutely. And can we just further go on to, again, with this just justification of the church and their support for the institution of slavery? Was there any particular, I guess, topics or examples that you can provide?
Well, when it comes to sort of churches, they were, I mean, it was so for instance, the Church of England,
Hmm.
which established church in Britain, anyway, were given plantations in Barbados, which were connected to a man named Christopher Codrington, who died in 1710. So he bequeathed his two plantations, I think at least two plantations in Barbados, to the Church of England. And the Church of England ran these plantations like going concerns. At their annual meetings, the Bishop of London and sometimes the Archbishop would sit down and discuss how to use the profits from those plantations, where should they invest them, and they would often talk about buying cows and livestock, and then also African chattels. So they were benefiting financially from this. I think one of the most shocking things about this particular, for want of a better word, enterprise, was the fact that the enslaved Africans on the Codrington plantation, well, the first thing was they were actually branded, some historians suggest, with the name of the actual organization, SPG or USPG, as was. I think the other thing was the fact that, despite the fact that it was the church that owned the plantation, there was no sense of them being benevolent or merciful towards their enslaved Africans. And history shows that the life span of longevity of an enslaved previal African, enslaved African, somebody doing field work, was actually less than on plantations that were run by individuals who were not Christians. So
Hmm.
there was a sense that the Church of England were any more merciful towards the care, the spiritual care of their enslaved Africans, and there's no sense that these enslaved Africans received any sort of spiritual instruction, and if they did, it was instruction of a brainwashing variety, and not this sense that the gospel is about setting people free. It was about liberation, but they twisted it and they preached a gospel that seemed to justify the enslavement of Africans.
And I guess further to that, what was, I guess, further involvement of the clergy and religious institutions, again, in the perpetuation of slavery? I guess, in examples of, what you were talking about in terms of the fact of using the Bible, so to speak, to perpetuate certain themes that, or twist certain uh, passages to the advancement. Do you have any other examples of that?
Yeah. So, for instance, in 1807,
Mm.
a mission-based organization under the instruction of the Bishop of London produced a version of the Holy Bible, a redacted version. So this Bible, basically, if you're familiar with your Bible, the Bible has 66 books. This Bible, I think 2/3 of it are removed. So, for instance, in the Old Testament, the whole book of Exodus, which talks about the enslavement and then the liberation of the Hebrew people in Egypt, that doesn't appear in the Bible. At least between something like 70 to 80% of the text of the verses in the Old Testament are not there. The Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and it's a similar thing in the New Testament as well. So if you actually look at this copy of the Bible, when you open it up, it says something like the Holy Bible for the instruction of Negro slaves in the West Indies. So that's the title of it. But the only thing that's kept in there are verses that seem to justify or condone African enslavement or condone slavery.
Mm-hmm.
In scripture that appears to condone or justify enslavement is kept in there, but any verse that appears to suggest or talk about liberation, freedom, ransom, or anything to do with setting people free is not there. That's been redacted, that's been edited. So it's again, like I say, it was written with the with the intention of instructing enslaved Africans in Christian doctrine and discipleship, but it's little short of it's just brainwashing by another term, really.
Yeah, no, for sure. And how did, the economic interests influence the church's stance on slavery?
Well, the church has clearly benefited financially from this. So the individuals who either own plantations or were engaged in some aspects of African chattel enslavement we're talking about a time when a lot of people went to church. Most people went to church, and the individuals who were involved in the slave trade would naturally use the monies that the profits that they made, they would give them to the church. Some of them would do so because out of a conscience thing. Some would do so because they just felt that's what you have to do as a Christian. But what you do see is that within certain churches, I think from the Church of England perspective, I think there's well over almost 2, if not 3 dozen churches that were built largely on the profits of individuals, or largely as a result of the monies that were given to the church by individuals who are inextricably linked to the African chattel enslavement. But you also have instances where individuals, if you look at the stained glass windows in churches, or the fonts, or the actual sort of items within the church, they're there through the largesse of individuals who were engaged in African chattel enslavement. So, the churches knew which side their bread was buttered, so to speak. And many of them weren't slow in accepting money. I mean, you have this situation, particularly within the Church of England, where it's called the Queen Anne's Bounty. So basically, it was a sum of money that the churches received. I think it was to do with some sort of pension fund that dates back to, I think, 1743. And the churches used this money to invest in the South Sea Company, but also in the slave trade. And the money, they invested wisely. And I think the Queen Anne's Bounty now is arguably worth something like £10 billion in modern day money. And this is money that is largely there as a result of engaging in forms of African chattel enslavement. I mean, it's important to say as well that there were other individuals who were against this, who weren't for this. So it's not just one negative tale of church complicity and collusion and corruption. There are individuals who weren't against it. I see what's fascinating is, particularly when it comes to the church, is that historically this aspect just wouldn't be told. All people wanted to talk about were individuals like William Wilberforce, as I said before, Thomas Clarkson, the Clapham sect, or as Eric Williams used to call them, the Clapham Saints, and others. So, I think it's important to get the balance right, even on a move from one kind of extreme to another. But it's about, historic truth telling. It's about saying, yeah, this happened, but this also happened as well. And these are the reasons as to why these events happened.
No, definitely to be able to give a balanced approach because, as I had told you before we had started talking, is when you're researching your family tree, especially within the Caribbean, the church has a significant involvement. And in terms of being able to access certain records, if it wasn't part of, especially British islands, if it wasn't part of the Church of England, you had to look at other records within other churches, and which were called at that time the dissenter records.
Yeah.
So it just you have to have a really broad perspective to be able to look at everything. And what would you say led to the shift in the church's perspective from supporting and now to opposing slavery?
Um, uh, some would say they've found their conscience. They recognize that what they were doing was wrong. That Africans are made in the image of God, just like everyone else. And it was wrong to treat another human being who's made in
Mm.
the image of God as if they were less than human. So
Mhm.
was that. I mean, again, you had certain dissenting denominations, such as the Quakers, who were one of the pioneer organizations or denominations of church groupings when it came to the abolition movement, who opposed aspects of African enslavement from the 17th century. So, given their kind of dissenting role and their lack of deference, particularly towards those who were in power, it sort of naturally led them to be people who would question, the status quo. And at the time, African enslavement was a part of the status quo. It was something that was accepted, it was something that was given, and they'd question this. I mean, it's a massive question. I mean, if you read Eric Williams's book, he would say it was to do with market forces rather than any kind of philanthropic or even sort of Christian moral conscience. Um, uh, I mean, he makes a really persuasive argument. I think there's more to it than that. I think from a British perspective, what you do find is in the second half of the 18th century, there was a massive religious revival. So you had people like George Whitfield, but also you had someone like John Wesley. And what was interesting about Wesley was he was a staunch uh, anti-slavery campaigner from the outset. So from the 1750s on, he was somebody who spoke out against the slave trade and slavery. So he wrote a book, famous book, 1773, Some Thoughts on Slavery, where he basically says it's incompatible with Christian teachings.
Mhm.
It's hard to not to underestimate the influence of someone like Wesley on British life.
Yeah.
In terms of his sermons, his writings, and I think that played a key role in it. And you had individuals like John Newton, who apparently, after he was a former slave trader himself, but he read um, uh, um, Wesley's book and realized, some of what he was doing was wrong. I think the other thing to recognize would be the role of the Africans themselves.
Yeah.
So, in Britain during the 18th century, during the Georgian era, um, it's estimated that there were anywhere between 15 to 25,000 African people in Britain. Some of them were former enslaved Africans. So, people like Equiano and Ignatius Sancho and the Sons of Africa. And these, again, were Christian, individuals who'd been baptized in St. Margaret's Church. And they had a vested interest in fighting for not only their own freedom, but the freedom of their brothers and sisters who were languishing on plantations or in, masters' houses in the Caribbean and in the North America. And although they were free, there was always this sense that they could easily be kidnapped and press ganged back into enslavement. So, their particular situation, even as free individuals, as free men and free women, was always dubious. It was always, they were all susceptible to re-enslavement. So they had a vested interest in fighting against slavery. And I think it's you can't underestimate really the influence of these men and women. Equiano's book, his interesting narrative was a bestseller. And apparently it was a book that Wesley read on his deathbed. So the last book that Wesley read before he died, this is John Wesley, was Equiano's interesting narrative. So, I think part of the problem is we in terms of, I always say this, in terms of how we teach how we teach history in England or in the United Kingdom in particular, is very skewed. So the things that we're talking about here, this is British history. Yeah. But in Britain, it gets confined to the category of Black history. So it's regarded as Black history. And in Britain, we mark Black History Month in October. So generally speaking, we tend to talk about these things in October during in the context of Black History Month. And some people, when they hear it's Black history, they just tune out. Sadly, even some Black people just tune out. But generally, people tune out and say, well, that's not my history, it's Black history. When really and truly this is British history, a fundamental aspect of British history at that. Yeah. And it's it's something that as British people, we need to engage with it.
No, definitely, definitely is a discussion, and that we need to at least be acknowledged and to have more talks about. And what would you say in terms of what are the long-term consequences of the church's dual role in both perpetuating and abolishing slavery?
Well, I think it was I would say racism. I think that's a long-term effect has been racism. So from a British perspective, when the ancestors of the enslaved Africans first started to come to Britain after 1948 as part of a Windrush generation, sadly, when it came to them trying to attend, the historical and mainstream churches, often they were rejected. Some of the racist ideas and the stereotypes and the tropes that have taken place, during the 18th and the 19th century, ideas that began in the Caribbean but filtered back to the United Kingdom, were met these largely Black people on arrival in Britain, and the churches themselves, rather than shape society, reflected what was taking place in society or the culture. So you had, Black people often, sometimes told, this isn't the right place for you. You should try the church down the road. Yeah. So they just clearly weren't treated with hospitality, rather hostility. So that really, I think, was a direct legacy of what had happened during the African chattel enslavement era.
No, I definitely would agree with you there. I know for a church that I went to, most of the Caribbeans that were coming into that church and the white individuals that were there, they started to create their own church because they didn't feel comfortable, right? So, and it was very odd to see that, growing up, to know that, well, if we're all under one God, why can't we all commune together, right? So it's just one of those things.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and that's I think it's an issue that a lot of churches have been grappling with ever since. How to be truly inclusive, recognizing difference, affirming it, celebrating it, rather than seeing it as a problem. And what we do know is that some people did leave these historic churches, these mainstream churches, because of sometimes at best it was indifference, and at worst it was just straight up racism. Yes. And established their own churches. Some people stayed, a lot of people stayed and fought the good fight, because they believed that in God's house, there is only one race, which is the human race. There shouldn't be any racism in God's house, so they stayed there, fought the good fight, sought to try to change hearts and minds. Sometimes, their mere presence drove people away. So you had situations where you had white flight. People left churches, and those sort of historic churches became black churches by default, really. But yeah, it's an uncomfortable history, just as talking about enslavement can be an uncomfortable history as well.
Yes, but it's just one of those discussions that we must have in order to be
Oh
able
yeah,
to
of course. It's an invaluable conversation. You've got to
yeah.
have it. You can't adopt the ostrich approach and stick your head in the ground and pretend it's just not happening, because that's dishonest.
Hmm.
If you set you free, then you've got to be prepared to hear unpalatable truths.
Yeah, definitely. And how should we, I guess, assess the moral responsibility of the church, considering its historical support for slavery?
I think, well, the truth was, the church is, historically went to parts of Africa, it went to parts of the Caribbean, to preach a gospel, which includes liberation, mercy, compassion, and love. So that's at the heart of the gospel. That's what they should have been preaching. Sadly, many of them didn't preach that. They preached something else. So when we talk about contested histories, I think part of the challenge facing the church today is to appraise, or someone to reappraise some of what it did. The good, the bad, and the downright ugly, as I
Yeah.
like to say, and grapple with that. You know, and often we use a term, particularly within church circles, of lament. Offering lament, which is a term that is used particularly in the Old Testament, where people acknowledge with a sense of shame and sadness, the wrong that they've done. And sometimes, I suppose, within the Old Testament sort of paradigm, it's usually to God, but within the sort of a paradigm that we're seeing now, it's to their fellow human being, their fellow men and women who are made in the image of God, but who were somehow treated as if they weren't. But it's an important process, and like any process, it takes time, but it's about ensuring that the church is actually engaged with the process.
Yeah.
Mm.
And would you say that there are any efforts today within the church to reconcile its past for its involvement in slavery?
Yeah, loads, absolutely loads. Particularly now, I always say, to me, it seems as if it's an idea whose time has come.
Yeah.
So, virtually, from a British perspective, with the exception, really, I would say, of the Catholic Church, all the historic denominations, and also some newer ones,
Hmm.
are looking into this particular history and seeking ways in which they can make amends or make reparations. And by reparations, we're talking about repair, repairing the damage that was done, recognizing that, the churches clearly, a lot of them clearly were not prophetic. They clearly weren't um, uh, um, at their best
Yeah.
during this time, and recognizing that there's a legacy to all of this. So, like I said, it's almost like a straight line going from enslavement to, seeing some of the ways in which particularly black people, are marginalized within church life, not given opportunities to exercise leadership or utilize their God-given talents to further God's kingdom. So, it's a difficult one for the church,
Yeah.
because the easiest thing would be to ignore it, and some would prefer that, because it's you know it requires challenging, and it requires changing, and often people don't like to be challenged, and definitely churches by nature are conservative institutions, and as
Hmm.
such don't like change. So that's going to be a struggle. But I think it's incumbent really on people of faith, particularly black people of faith, to have the courage, to have the fortitude, to have the wherewithal to actually say, well, we need to, we need to stand up and address this.
Yeah.
We can't keep ignoring uh, uh, the truth of what has taken place.
No, for sure. And as we, end this discussion, what would you say as to leave the listeners with any final thoughts as to how to, I guess, to think about or this past and how to move forward?
I think the first thing is we need to really engage with that history. Um, you know, it's important to recognize how the past still influences the present, and can potentially influence the future as well. So we need to be able to be au fait with the past,
Yeah.
and some of what we might sort of find in that history is uncomfortable.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't engage with it. We should do so with patience. We should do so with humility. We should do so with sensitivity. Um, but we should do so nonetheless. We should exercise all those things and more. And I think what should be the watchword is historic truth telling.
Hmm.
This sense, the truth does set you free. Um, but we've got to be prepared to break the silence on these issues. So it's not enough to say, well, it happened such a long time ago. Why are we talking about this? Well, the fact is, a lot of the legacies of that, whether people recognize it or not, are still with us today.
Yes.
You know, um, so we need to have that kind of conversation, particularly from a church perspective.
Hmm.
Um, it's easy to adopt a colorblind approach. Saying that we're all one in Christ, and which we are, but that doesn't mean we're not different. Because
Yeah.
we're different, there can be a unity in diversity, and that diversity doesn't have to be divisive. And that's the whole thing. It can be celebrated, um, but we need to recognize that we do live in an unfair and an unequal world, and what characterized or typified that was African chattel enslavement, where everything white was deemed to be correct, and everything black was negative.
Hmm.
Um, and you only have to look at in a dictionary, and find out that kind of terminology, those kinds of euphemisms, and those kinds of not so analogies really still exist in our language today. So certain people are affirmed and certain people are not, to put it simply, as a result of that. But it's important to have that conversation. That's what I'm
Yes.
saying. We need to have that conversation. We need to engage critically and intentionally with our history.
No, no, thank you. I agree with what you're saying. So thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. And I will ensure that your book is listed in the show notes as well as some of the other ones that you've mentioned as well, so people can be able to further delve deeper and
Well,
get a better understanding. So, but thank you so much, Richard. I really do appreciate
it's
it.
been a pleasure. Okay, thank you very much.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.